Okay, so we're live and we have 17 participants at this moment. Pam, why don't you take it away?
Have you got me muted there? There we go. So welcome to the NOLA BEECA Project's Pollinator Protection Program. With good luck, we'll have David Burwell, who is the chair of the NOLA BEECA Project and also one of our members, will be entering as soon as he can figure out the process, and he will have more to say. But I wanted to just introduce Dr. Robert Gegear, who has kindly offered to help us gain a deeper understanding of the ecological implications of the loss of pollinators, especially bumblebees, in our area. And Dr. Gegear is the assistant professor at UMass Dartmouth and is also the recipient of a National Science Foundation grant to build citizen science participation in this, this work. We're really grateful to have him on, and he is going to help us with a field program where we get to practice photographing bumblebees and identifying them and figuring out which forage plants are most attractive to which bees. He will say a lot more about that. And when David Burwell is able to be on here, he will say a lot more about the NOLA BEECA project eventually. And in the meantime, let's get rolling.
Okay. All right. So thank you very much for that introduction. It's my pleasure to be here and chat with you today. Let me share my screen. This is the first Zoom workshop that I've given. I've been asked to give a few later in the summer, so this is my first attempt. So I'm sure there'll be a few hiccups along the way. Hopefully not too many. Let me share my screen with you. Okay, so I was trying to come up with a theme for the workshop to help to describe the different components that I'm planning over the next couple of days. So I came up with using BEECOLOGY to develop curriculum for integrated K-12 STEM plus C education. So the BEECOLOGY is the citizen science project that I developed, 4 years ago now, to help my research on pollinator decline and biodiversity conservation. And you'll notice that here I've included K-12 STEM plus C, and I'll get to that in a minute. And I know that people here are K-8. But over the past couple of years, I've been working at the high school level to bring BEECOLOGY and developing curriculum that is pretty much complete at this point, and we're getting ready to disseminate. So we've got a team of computer scientists helping us to get it online, to make it available to teachers and provide student resources and a whole bunch of goodies that I'll get to in more detail tomorrow. So, you know, the STEM plus C, the C stands for computer science and digital literacy. And so what our curriculum does at the high school level is through BEECOLOGY, we're developing curriculum for computer science teachers. So they're using pollination systems and the problem of decline, the decline of such systems or degradation of such systems as a backdrop for design. So it's a design problem that they can then go forward and you know, learn computer science concepts and practices. And on the other side, so that the STEM side, we're integrating the STEM disciplines and bringing in computer science. And so, you know, the biology, the computational thinking is the main thing that we're bringing into the biology side. So we've developed a fully integrated curriculum. And because of the success at the high school level, and because the core ideas are very similar, the practices are similar, I do think it'll fit well the middle and elementary school level. And I hope through this that we will be able to get interested schools together to move forward and get NSF funding or extend our current NSF grant to try to fund and get this curriculum developed for elementary and middle school. And I will say that a lot of what we're doing at the high school level, I have already brought in. So I have a son that's 8 and a daughter that's 7. And so I brought it into their classrooms. So it can be modified, the activities can be changed, but the concepts stay the same. And so I hope to cover those today. So the plan is, then today we're going to talk, it's more today's background, more content. So pollination systems core content. So although the Beecology project has bee in the name, it really, bee is only a part of what the project is about. It's more about not just the animals, but also the plants, which together form what are called pollination systems. And we'll learn with a difference between pollinators and current focus, current conservation strategies focused and curriculum focused on pollinators, and how what it's missing, and what pollination systems, that term, what it means, and how it helps to fill in to help you to cover more of the key concepts in a particular. So for life sciences, to cover all the key concepts instead of just 1 or 2. I'll then, based on that information, I'll transition to talk about the Beecology project. What is the goal? Why was there a need to develop a Beecology project, and how does it work, very basically? And then we'll finish with the Beecology web app, which will help us to get ready for tomorrow when we're out in the field. So tomorrow morning, we're going to go out and we're going to use the app. We're going to collect data and talk about observation, data collection, and hypothesis testing, and what you can do with the app and what you can do with the habitats that you've all developed. How can we use those to meet next generation science standards? And again, we've done this at the high school level, and I have some ideas, and in the afternoon we're going to talk about those ideas to try to at least lay the foundation for curriculum development. I know that the stuff I've been doing at the high school level, we've had summer institutes where we get high school computer science and biology teachers working together to develop the curriculum. And so we're not going to do all of that tomorrow, but what we can do is identify key areas. We can talk about activities and lesson plans, and I'll show you some of the lesson plans we have at the high school level, which I strongly feel that could be modified to bring right into the classroom at the middle and elementary school level. Okay. Oh, the other thing is to talk about the technology. So it's not just about the biology. As I said, we have a whole system of technology and computational tools that go along with the biology, and the possibilities are endless about how you can use this and what level. And just to give you an idea, as I said, so for life sciences core ideas, the Beecology project and thinking about pollination systems in general cover all 4 of these very easily. And so what I'm going to do today is talk about pollination systems in a way that would allow you to bring it into one of these 4 core ideas, whichever one you're comfortable with. And what we've been doing at the high school level, the idea is not to add on to load, but to swap out. So we develop things, and maybe you're doing one thing, we can swap it out with something that's more focused on pollination systems and Beecology. That's the idea. And so I'm going into detail on all of these, but I don't expect everybody to go in as much detail. I expect you to be pulling things that you think are interesting, ideas and activities, and then developing those and trying to bring those into your classroom. So what we've done so far, and pollination systems and the Beecology project itself covers all 8 of these science and engineering practices. So this is all taken from the Massachusetts curriculum framework from 2016. So we can go right from asking questions, and again, we bring in the engineering and technology. We can define problems. Computer science falls in here, and go all the way through to obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. So the curriculum that we have can be adjusted to various, to different levels at the, so different levels based on teacher background and comfort zone. So if you haven't done a lot with computer science, we have something for you. If you've done a lot in computer science and biology, we have something for you. In addition, at the student level, we have things that, you know, students vary in their background and expertise, especially with computer science. So we have things that can be adjusted to cover everybody, even people that are students that are exceptional can keep going up basically to get to the level of designing their own experiment and collecting data with the tools that we have. They could do their own project. And that brings them right up into high school and certainly even beyond into the university setting. On the computer science side, so here are the practices from digital literacy and computer science. At this stage, they're not as developed, but we have developed our curriculum from the CS side to cover all of these as well. Again, with the idea of pollinator decline and the plant-pollinator relationships, how does that serve as a foundation to start building technology to address the problem? That's built into the curriculum as well. So as I said, I'll go into this tomorrow in a lot more detail, talk about the project and you know, our team approach, interdisciplinary team approach, and different things. Today, the plan is, so I've got 3 sections I want to cover. So the first one is basically background content. What is a pollination system versus what is a pollinator? And when we want to focus on conservation, we really need to think about the system, not just the pollinators. And why is thinking about the system important? Not only from a conservation perspective, but from a you know, K through 8 or K through 12, trying to meet next generation science standards. Why is it important from that perspective as well? I'll then move into identifying and solving the problem. This is where we talk about conservation. What do we do? The BEECOLOGY project, and also the question, what should I plant? How do I decide when I'm creating a garden or a habitat? What do I need to think about when I'm designing that garden? And certainly, you know, here it's not a problem to put in some plants that will pull in a bunch of bees or butterflies. But in terms of conservation, you can't just, that's not going to work. You need to really have a strategy for a particular species that's in trouble. And as a teaching point, you know, you can talk about, okay, well, is it okay to just see 100 bees, or should we be seeing the bees that are in trouble? Why is it important, and what will we need to do to be able to help that specific species? What do we need to know? And you can, you know, branch things out from there. Lastly, I'll finish with the BEECOLOGY web app. So this is the latest version of the web app, was released about a month ago. A lot of improvements, and we'll talk about where to find it. And I'll give you a crash course in bumblebee identification. We'll get into this more tomorrow. Usually when I do the workshop, I have an indoor and an outdoor component, which I can't do because we can't get into a room and watch some videos and a talk and then go out in the field and come back. So I'm going to try to set it up to give you the information now and maybe a little bit of homework to do before we go out in the field tomorrow, if that's okay, and we'll see how we are for time there. Okay, so I'm going to start very broadly and sort of focus down to the system. And you could use this to introduce the idea of pollination systems and to help to ground what's going to be covered. So obviously biology, the study of life. If we look at life on the planet, there are 8.7 million estimated types of life, 1.2 million classified. And if we look at, I don't know how to do, I'm assuming you can see my pointer here. Hopefully you can. If we look at the different groups of life that we see, all of these up to here, this is all the insects, right? So primarily what we're dealing with are insects, and then we look at the plants over here, and the vast majority of these plants are flowering plants. So a good number of types of life on the planet are comprised of insects and plants. And you can see here, vertebrates, it's just 1%. So most of what's going on when it comes to interactions between animals and plants, it's really talking about insects and plants. That's not to say that vertebrates aren't there. They're just not as important as we may think they are, because they get a lot of attention because they're cute and they have a backbone. So we have all these different types. So how do we organize them? So we've got the Linnaean classification system, you know, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And if we look at so, you know, you can go through, if we look at our bee on our flower here, we can go down the classification system for bees, Hymenoptera, Apidae, down into the genus. So Bombus is the genus for bumblebees, and then Fervidus would be the species. And we're going to see what makes a Fervidus different from a Bimaculatus in this group. We can do the same thing for the plant. So we can classify the plant. Here we've got Trifolium pratense, which is red clover. And so that's how we're going to organize things. We're going to look at things from the species, the level of species. That's a very important point, because when we look at the way that people treat pollinators, they tend to treat them as groups: the bumblebees, the solitary bees, the butterflies. But in reality, there are many, many species, and each one of them likes and does a different thing, which we'll get to in a second. And so it's very important that we think about things and interactions at the species level rather than these general interactions between groups at higher taxonomic levels, like at the genus or the family level. We can also look at different levels of biological organization. So we've got here, we go up to the individual organ system. So if we think of pollinators, we can think of their nervous system, their learning and memory abilities, and then how does that affect the behavior of individuals when it's visiting flowers. When we continue up from individual, we go then to groups, which are populations. Here, the key unit is the species. So a group of individuals that interbreed or potentially interbreed and produce viable offspring. That's our general definition of species, and the definition varies. The point is, a collection of species is a community. So that's an interaction between organisms. And then if we look at the next level up, ecosystems, the organisms are interacting with other organisms as well as with their environment. And then we look at, we increase the scale. But what I want to point out here is that when we look at the system here, the nervous system, if I affect the nervous system of a pollinator with a pesticide, it changes its behavior. It makes it less able to interact with plants. The plants have costs because they're not pollinating as well, which has effects on population and then can disrupt the community and also the ecosystem, which is supported by that community. So in the pollinator system, it's very easy to go from the level of even looking at cells, atoms, all the way through to look at ecosystems or biomes. And that really, going from individuals to populations to ecosystems, is a part of those connections need to be made to really understand why pollinators are important and why pollination systems are important and why we should try to protect them. So ecology then, it's just studying those interactions. As I mentioned, if we have interactions between organisms, we can have interactions between organisms and their environment. If we look at the types of interactions between organisms, there's competition, communications. This is within species. We also have interspecific. So this is, think of at the species level, two species competing with one another. One's a predator, one's a prey. We have mutualisms, and this can be between animals and also, as we'll see, between animals and plants as well. They can be mutually beneficial, and people often think of plant-pollinator interactions as mutually beneficial, but in fact they're not. It's a conflict, and what helps the pollinator is not helping the plant, and so this conflict between plants and pollinators is what's driving floral evolution and the diversity of animals and flowering plants that we see, and the connections between them. So we want to keep that in mind. So we look at the species interactions, again, in the context of plants and pollinators. If we look at our bumblebee, we can think of a plant-pollinator interaction here. If this bee is actually pollinating the milkweed, we can have host pathogen interactions, so looking at bumblebee pathogens and how they affect the health of the bee and also how they would affect their ability as pollinators. We have predator-prey interactions. We also here have plant-herbivore actions. So if we're on milkweed, we've got our milkweed, our monarch larvae feeding on the milkweed. So, you know, looking at things from this perspective, we start to see connections, that everything is interconnected. And this is the main theme, and the main thing that separates pollinators from pollination systems is that we're talking about connections, ecological networks, and ecosystem processes rather than just focused on the animal. And hopefully that will become more clear as we go along. So we're focused on the interactions between plants and pollinators. Now in that, there is some plant herbivore, because the butterflies at the larval stage need to eat, feed on plants to get to the adult stage where they'll become pollinators to feed on the flowers. And so, you know, plant pollinator interactions in the general way, at least things that will become pollinators, but we need to consider the larval stages as well when we're thinking about what to plant. All right, so the term pollinator, as I mentioned, is used very widely. I'm sure you've all heard about pollinators, pollinator decline, and I would say that at this point, the term pollinator is abused more than it's used in the proper way or in a productive way. Typically, when you hear pollinator, you immediately think of bee, and if you think of bee, you think about honeybee, or if you think about pollinator, you think about food. And that is really what was pushed, and certainly is an important side of things, but it isn't even close to the entire picture. So the term pollinator itself is related to the process of pollination, and that is actually a plant-based term. The pollination is plant reproduction. It has really nothing to do with the animal, other than the animal is the vehicle that enables the plant to reproduce. And if we look at, and I'm sure you've seen this, I know my daughter brought this home to learn about pollination. You know, we've got our basic composite type flower, where we've got our pollen produced by the stamens. It needs to find the stigma, the surface of the stigma. We then get pollen tube growing fertilization taking place, and then we get further seed fruit development that falls, and we get the cycle continued germination, and we get the seedling forming. Now, the pollination occurs when fertilization takes place. So the transfer of pollen by itself is not pollination. Pollination is completing the process of fertilization and further development. Now, in the simplified flower, it seems that all you have to do is shake the flower or get some wind or rain to knock it around, and you'll get pollen dropping on the surface, and you may get fertilization taking place. The problem is that when you do that, the plant is effectively fertilizing itself, and that has costs associated with it. And so the vast majority of plants, although some can self, they usually do it if they absolutely need to. A few plants do. The vast majority of plants are what are called self-incompatible. That means that they get their pollen from themselves, and you don't get the fertilization taking place. So it's not pollination. Most plants need their pollen to be transferred to another plant of the same species, preferably totally unrelated. And that, when you do that, that increases the genetic diversity in your offspring, and helps you to respond to environmental change. Here we get, if we self, so you can have both male and female parts on the same flower. You could have male and female flowers on the same plant, or you could have male and female flowers on different plants. So plants have a wide variety of strategies. It's far more complicated than this shows, and understanding those differences is important to understand why we have flowers that look the way they do, and understand what the importance of the system actually is. So you can get selfing occurring in different ways, and plants have strategies to minimize selfing. So they'll have male flowers here, female flowers on the top. Bumblebees always like to start on the bottom of inflorescence and forage up. So when they forage on the bottom, they pick up the pollen, and, female flowers on the bottom, males on the top. So when they come in from another plant, they deposit the pollen, and as they leave the plant, they pick up pollen to go to another plant. So they've got different systems. So outcrossing is what they want, but we can get the pollinator, let's say the pollinator decides to move to this plant species, so a different plant species. This is still pollen transfer, but the problem is that what happens is that the foreign pollen blocks the surface of the stigma on this plant and prevents it from receiving its own pollen. So this pollinator is actually this plant is incurring two reproductive costs. So there's reproductive costs from the donor because it's wasting pollen on a species, like trying to mate with another species. And this recipient is also receiving a cost, a reproductive cost, in that it can't receive its own pollen. It's sterilizing the flower. So knowing what the pollinators are doing in terms of behavior is extremely important to understand its role as a pollinator. Is it a good pollinator going from here to here, or is it a bad pollinator, a less efficient pollinator, or not pollinating at all if it's moving from here to here? And so we need to differentiate between a pollinator. So you need to know, is it doing the job for the plant, or a flower visitor? So everything can be classified as a flower visitor if it's on a flower getting food in the form of pollen and nectar, but not everything can be classified as a pollinator. It depends on the target plant species. And this is a very important point that tends to be missed across the board, because they're focused on pollinator and animal rather than the system, which is the plant and the pollinator together, and the needs of the plant. So if we look at flowering plants, so plants that, as I said, the vast majority of plants are flowering plants. The vast majority of flowering plants rely on animals for pollination. So some are wind pollinated and some are water pollinated, and those are interesting systems. But they're very inefficient, right? If you have the winds blowing one direction and your mate is the other, is upwind, it's going to be very inefficient. You're not going to get your pollen to the right place. Similarly with water, if your mate is downstream, great, but if it's upstream, you're in trouble. So that's why there's been strong selection for plants to employ animals to help them to get the job done. So worldwide, there are about 300 species of flowering plants that need animal pollination, and there are roughly 200,000 known species of flower visiting animals that act as pollinators of something. Now, the reason I call them flower visiting animals here is because there isn't a single plant species on this side that can provide food to everything on this side, and there isn't a single animal on this side that can provide pollination services to everything on this side. What we see are these sub relationships, right? So we may have certain plants here that are visited by long-tongue bees or butterflies. So they have a match. These two things act together, and collectively they're called a pollination system. This is a postage stamp from a few years ago. We've got, you can see we've got bats, we've got a small mammal here, and we've got a hummingbird. And as I mentioned, excuse me, that of the 200,000 species, only 1,000 or so are vertebrates. So the vast majority are insects. And if we look at this bumblebee, for example, this one bumblebee represents 4,000 bee species. So 50 bumblebees, but there are thousands of other bees. One butterfly, there are thousands of butterfly species, wasps. So there's much more diversity than this leads on. And the reason that we have this view is because the honeybee, which everybody's familiar with, is one species. Now, there may be some races in that species, but it's just one species. So people tend to think, oh, bumblebees, it's just one thing, because they've got it in their heads that because honeybees one, that the rest must be the same, and that's utterly false. We look at pollinators native to North America. As I said, 4,000 bee species, carpenter bees, so those are the ones chewing holes in your deck right now. 33 species. Bumblebees, as I said, 50. They're about 25 east, 25 west. 1,200 species of honeybees. So these small bees, which are beautiful, are very small. They're very fast, difficult to see, but they are important in the system. They have plant matches. Butterflies, even beetles, wasps, and flies are fly-pollinated native plants and moth-pollinated plants as well. So we've got each one of these is equally important. So although the bees get a lot of attention, they are just one of many that are equally important in getting the job done when it comes to the 13,000 or so flowering plant species we have in North America that need animals for pollination. They form these subsystems. So how is it then that we can get so many thousands of species of flower visiting animal and thousands of species of flowering plants coexisting? And so this draws to what's called this is related to what's called the competitive exclusion principle, and it's pretty straightforward. And that is that two species that that are competing for the same limited resource, they can't stably coexist. One is going to eventually outcompete the other. So if they do coexist, it's because there's something about those two species that differs, that gives them an advantage, or they're different in some way that allows them to coexist. It could be something as simple as species 1 is around in April and species 2 is around in May, so that they don't overlap. It could be that species 1 uses plant species A, plant species 2 uses plant species B, or something like that. So there's been strong selection to get species, and this isn't just from the animal side, from the plant side as well, to get separation, so that plants are using a subset of pollinators and they're tuned to those pollinators, and the animals that are visiting those flowers are tuned to exploit those plants. Those two work together, and there's coevolution, which I'll talk about in a second, that keeps them linked together. The reason that these differences that I'm talking about are adaptations. So there are certain characteristics that allow them to survive and reproduce better in a given environment, or have the flexibility to respond to a certain amount of change. And so that ability to survive and reproduce is called fitness. And these adaptations can be physiological, so it may be anatomical, so this easy physical appearance, tongue links could be different structures, or it could be behavioral. So this could be the sensory systems differ, or they have innate behavior versus learned behavior. And so this is where the cognitive comes in. So bees are really smart, bumblebees in particular, and they've been strong selection on those bees to be able to exploit a wide variety of different flower types and do so very quickly to maximize the amount of food they're bringing in per unit time. And I study all of these different adaptations, and also what is the reciprocal adaptation on the side of the flowering plants. So the process to do this is natural selection, and I know I'm covering things that I'm sure you're aware of, but I'm hoping that by filling in these gaps, you can see points where you could say, oh, that's interesting. I see how I could work that into the classroom. So, if I suspect that, I'm saying things you already know, but I'm trying to say them in a way where it might help you to bring in the idea of pollination systems. So bear with me. I'll get to some things maybe you're not as familiar with in a minute. So we've got variation, characteristic must be heritable, differences in reproductive success, and then we get natural selection taking place. It's as simple, if you meet these conditions, it's going to occur. And we see it all the time, right? So in the terms of artificial selection. So instead of the environment or the interactors, the organisms that are interacting driving selection, here we're doing it. So it's very familiar in plants, and we'll get to this when we start talking about what do I plant. So we can select for flower color, we can select for shape, we can select for odor, all these different things. And this is a major problem. And I'll talk about why we don't want to do this and put them into our pollinator conservation habitats. But we also see this in animals, right? All the dogs that we have are through artificial selection. We've bred them to look a certain way and to behave a certain way. And it's not just dogs. Here we have, it's a terrible image of a tumbler pigeon. So they look like they're falling out of the sky. We've got homing pigeons as well. That have been bred for their homing behavior. So we've selected certain traits we like and only allowed those individuals to reproduce. If we take things into plant pollinator systems, we see something similar, but instead of us doing the selecting, the animals are doing the selecting on floral traits. So if we look at some, here are some plant species complexes. So lobelia, which is present here. You probably have seen Lobelia cardinalis and syphilitica. The mimulus system, monkey flowers. We've got a red one and another bumblebee pollinated one, and we also have penstemons. This is out west. This one's out west as well. The point is that these look very similar, but in fact, these are sister species. So if I took pollen from this one and put it on this one, I would get a hybrid offspring that would show me intermediate traits between the two. So for monkey flowers, I take pollen here and put it over here. I get pink flowers that kind of look like this one. And in the next generation, if I were to take those seeds and make those plants, I get a wide range of shapes and colors that fills in the gap between these two. Now, the interesting thing is that in the wild where they coexist, you don't see any hybrids or very few. Why? That's because of the behavior of their most efficient pollinator. So all of these are pollinated by hummingbirds, and all of these are pollinated by bumblebees. So the idea is that there are certain traits in bumblebees and hummingbirds that their foraging behavior and their foraging preferences acted as a source of selection on floral traits. And then eventually, when they got together, were strong enough, the behavioral preferences were strong enough to form a reproductive barrier between the two. And that has led to speciation, right? So if we have selection and we have reproductive isolation that's sustained, then we have a speciation event that has taken place. And I've looked at this and studied this since my PhD to see, do these animals have the preferences that could actually drive this? And so what I did was, and again, this is thinking of classroom activities. You're not going to be putting arrays out for bees and hummingbirds, or maybe you could, but certainly there are other activities I've thought of which we'll talk about tomorrow. The point is that we have these artificial flowers that have a color, but they also have a genotype, right? So the genes producing the color, so some combinations produce blue, and then the other extreme is red down here. And we presented naive bumblebees and hummingbirds, which weren't naive, these arrays of an ancestral population. We wanted to see, did they have the behavioral preference that would select for certain colors, different colors? Would we see what's called divergence? And so what we did was we'd allow them to select. We would count what they visited, how many times they visited, and then we would infer certain number of seeds produced and certain amount of pollen that's transferred. And we looked at this over 8 generations. And what we see is, and in hummingbirds it happened even sooner than 8 generations, it only took about 3, we see that the population goes from ancestral to a blue and a red and a blue flowered population. And that the birds like this one and the bees like this one. Now, interestingly, this was based on color alone, so they all have the same reward. In the case of the bumblebees, we had to increase the nectar concentration of the blue flowers. And that led to strong selection for blue because they associated blue with a higher reward. The other ones had, and interestingly, in this system, nectar is genetically speaking, is tightly linked to color. So that the bumblebee flowers have concentrated nectar, which bumblebees like, in blue flowers. Hummingbirds have red color and dilute nectar. So 10% sucrose versus 30. Bumblebees don't like 10% sucrose. They treat it like water. And so by doing that, having those two things combined, you can separate out the bees and the birds if you're a plant. This has implications for when we decide what are we going to plant, and relates back to what I was saying about cultivars. In cultivars, we are selecting for flower color. Color is tightly linked to nectar. And so when we change the color, we're changing the nectar. And that's not a good thing, because often what happens is we take the nectar out of the system because we change the color so much that the nectar gets compromised in some way. And we have nice looking flowers to us that don't do anything for the animal. And we need to pay attention to that. And we'll talk about that later. So this is selection from one side, but what we can get is selection back on the other side and get what's called coevolution. So here we've got our animals selecting for flower traits on the plant side, but also the plants, variation in the plants, are selecting for certain traits on the side of the animal. So those things are going back and forth. And we see them not just in plant pollinator, we see it in host parasite and predator-prey relationships, as well as competition, these coevolutionary arms races, if you will, where we get rapid divergence of traits to certain extremes. The best example of this is this system. Oops, let me get rid of this. This system where we have the flies and these long tubular flowers. And we can see, so here, this is showing you the coevolution. So what happens is that the flowers have a reproductive advantage if their nectar is located beyond where the pollinator can reach, just beyond where they can reach. So the pollinator has to, in this case, the fly, has to force its head into the flower. And when it does that, here is the pollen in this pollen sac. Here it is here as well. And so, so that benefits the plant. But what happens is that there's selection on the side of the fly to get a longer tongue so it can get all of the nectar in the flower. And when it gets a long tongue, it then doesn't, its face doesn't press up against the stamens to get the pollen out. And so you can see how this back and forth has led to these really long-tongued fly species and these long tubular flowers. You can see how those two match. And in fact, Darwin observed this flower and said there must be an animal that has a tongue that matches this. And then, I don't know, a few decades later, they actually found the fly with the tongue that matches. And this is a highly specialist system where the fly and the plant, you need those two. If one dies, the other one dies type thing. Okay, putting this together then into the concept of pollination systems, we have these relationships between plants and animals where the animal is, the plant is exploiting the animal to maximize its reproductive success. So we look at our hummingbird pollinator here. The nectar is located down here. The bird moves into place. Look where the pollen is placed, on the forehead of the hummingbird. Why? You can imagine if we place pollen on the wing of the hummingbird, we wouldn't have much pollen left. It's not a very efficient system. So they've evolved this what's called pollen placement strategy, right on the forehead where it's difficult for the pollinator to remove it. Here we've got bumblebees in a tubular flower. Here is the female part, the male part's located in here, so it scrapes or on a different flower. But notice it's placed on the thorax of the bee. Why? Because that is very difficult for the bee to groom off. You can imagine if you have an itch in the middle of your back, you're trying to scratch it, you can't get to that spot. You need to get, you know, a ruler or something to try to get at it. It's the same thing with these bees. They can't get that pollen, and that's the way the plant maximizes pollen delivery. We talked about this example already. Here's a butterfly pollinated plant species. Notice the pollen on its tube. Sticky pollen on the tongue, so as the butterfly probes, it starts to pollinate. Now, these are pollinators. The reason for the red flowers, by the way, isn't because the hummingbirds prefer red. It's actually because bees are less efficient exploiting red flowers, and it's to deter bees, just like the nectar is to deter bees rather than to attract hummingbirds. So there's a push and pull that's going on in these systems to try to deter less efficient pollinators. Why? Because this bumblebee, if it went into this flower, it would crawl in the bottom to get to the nectar. It would not touch the reproductive surfaces. By the way, the female part in this flower is here. So as this bird moves to a new plant and moves into position, its forehead swipes up against the female part, transferring the pollen, and then picks up more pollen as it sticks its beak in to get the nectar. Similarly, this hummingbird will stick its tongue into this penstemon flower, and it won't, you know, beaks are shiny and smooth. It's not going to pull very much pollen out. It's going to be very inefficient and lose a lot of pollen. So these flowers have concentrated nectar that the hummingbirds don't prefer, and that helps to deter them as well. So just note that these systems are push and pull, but they are complicated. One fits the other, and you have to make sure that you get both sides and we'll see why it's important to have both sides in the system as we start talking about ecosystems and biodiversity. To give you an example, let's see here, I've got, let's share sound here. This is from Tom Lotzenheiser, who's at Mass Audubon in your general area. Many of you may know Tom. And so this is one of our species in trouble, Bombus vagans. This is a bottle gentian. And hopefully you can hear it buzzing to try to get inside this flower. So in a bottle gentian, the tube is, the petals are fused together, and the bee has to crawl inside to get the nectar, which is located at the bottom of this tube. And you can hear it trying very hard to get in, and eventually you just see its legs out as it goes in to get the nectar and flies to the next. So this is a bumblebee pollinated flower and a part of a bumblebee pollination system. Now what's interesting about this system is that only a small percentage of bumblebees find the nectar. So from the plant's perspective, why would you be deterring most of your pollinators, your good pollinators? And the answer is, for those few bees that get in here, there's so much nectar that they want to restrict their visits to and find, and they'll travel far and wide to find another bottle gentian flower because of the amount of nectar, and that maximizes pollen transfer efficiency from the plant side. And the bees are getting the most nectar, so it's in their best interest to specialize. And that's where we get this what's called a coevolutionary compromise between the plants and the bees. Okay, so how is it that pollinators select flowers? And I know I've looked at other curriculum related to pollinators, and inevitably they have bumblebees like blue flowers, hummingbirds like red flowers, and all of that is not true for the vast majority of pollinators. There are a few that have innate preferences for a color or a scent, but the vast majority are generalists, which means that they are operating based on the reward level of the flower, and they learn which ones are good and which ones are bad, and they constantly sample to update their information and make very complicated behavioral decisions based on the information that they have stored in memory. So to show you this, and this is I've used many times in classrooms. Let me turn off the volume here if I can. Just because you don't need to hear this. So here's our monarch butterfly. If you touch the legs of a monarch butterfly with sucrose solution, which is at the bottom of this stick, and this is actually an in-class activity that you could do, you see that the tongue comes out. This is like Pavlov's dog, right? You show meat, ring the bell, or show meat, saliva, you ring the bell. In the case of the butterflies, we're going to show it a color, and you'll notice that the tongue did not come out, showing that it does not have an innate reference for yellow. And we've done that with a wide variety of colors and odors and shapes, and we don't see the tongue coming out for this, suggesting there's an innate preference. So you pair it together, and then you test. So as soon as the tongue touches the sucrose, that bee or that butterfly learned that yellow was rewarding. You show it other colors. You notice that the antennae is not moving, the tongue's not moving. This is a very similar color to the test color, getting in the same part of the color spectrum. We then show it the test color, and right away we see the tongue coming out, looking for that reward, and the antennae coming down to try to find reward. This butterfly learns this pairing after just three pairings, and it can remember it for a couple of months. So even though they have a brain the size of a pinhead, they can learn and remember an extensive amount of information. By the way, these butterflies were also trained to learn an odor reward association, and they remembered both the odor and the color. I think I had them up to 2 months, those that were still living. I tested migrants and summer butterflies, and males and females, and they could all do this, and they all had really good memory. Going to bumblebees in the lab, this is part of my day job, the research I do looking at the cognitive abilities and how it relates to flowering plants. Here's my artificial bottle gentian flower. So here the bee has to learn to lift up this cap to crawl inside to get the nectar located, or sucrose solution located at the bottom. It keeps trying on the outside, lifting. It has to lift up in the right place and crawl and compress its body at the same time. So this is what's called operant condition. This is Pavlovian conditioning. And you see eventually it learns to lift up the cap to crawl inside and gets the sucrose reward. You can see its proboscis out there a little bit. Now, if we look at the same bee a few flower visits later, we see a very dramatic change of behavior. The bee slides into place, compresses its body, and crawls right inside the tube, no problem. So this is sensory motor learning, and that's how they learn. So the bees get better with more experience. And again, this works into this adaptive decision making and the costs and benefits of making decisions. So different types of learning, I could go into more sophisticated cognitive abilities like working memory and various things, but we'll save that for now. Basic memory, just to show that even though they have small brains, they can still learn and they can still make complex decisions. Okay, at this point, so what time did we start here? We started at 1:30, it's almost 2:30. So what I'm gonna do is just take a break here, 5-minute break. I can answer any questions. and then we'll move on to the next session. So we'll say it's 25 after, so we'll meet up again at 2:30, if that's okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you very much. We'll be back at 2:30.
I'm just going to take a bio break, and then I'll be back to answer any questions you might have about the first.
Could you unshare your screen first?
I am going to do that, yes. Stop share. All right.
Just, while we have a chance, if you want to introduce yourselves, I'm hoping that many of you will meet each other, and you're coming from at least 5 schools, I think 6 schools now. And we've been working with 5 of those schools, and one new school coming is the Greenfield Middle School. So if you have a question, if you just introduce your name and say what school you come from and what grade level.
If I could, you can unmute yourself by clicking on a bar in, the little microphone on your lower left-hand corner. If you're calling in on a phone, you can mute and unmute yourself by pressing *6.
Oh, you're on. Who has?
I'm Anna Marhefka from Greenfield Middle School. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you all for inviting us. I teach 5th grade.
My name is Amber Talick. I teach at Holloman Elementary School. I'm the hay teacher, the agriculture teacher and coordinator. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here as well.
I'm Drew Johnson. I teach 8th grade STEM at Mohawk Trail Regional.
I'm Roberta Allen. I work at Irving Elementary. I'm paraprofessional / experiential learning program. I work throughout K through 6th.
Okay. Well, I'll jump in because I'm Jane Urban, not my husband's name seems to appear on the screen. I'm the librarian at Irving Elementary, along with Becky, and I think there are a few others of us from Irving. I'm the school librarian for pre-K to grade 6.
I'm Julie Erickson. I also teach at Greenfield Middle School, where Anna teaches, and I'm the 6th grade special education teacher with undergrad background in ecology.
Hello, I'm Suzanne Taylor, and I teach at the Coleraine Central School, grade 3, and we had hoped to work with Nolambika this spring on a pollinator service learning project, which we will manage to fit in the future, hopefully.
Hi, I'm Kim Noyes. I coordinate the education programs at Northfield Mountain Recreation and Environmental Center and do teacher training and work with school children for field trips.
Hi, I'm Deborah Baser, not Larry, as it says on the screen. If someone can show me how to change the name, that. But I'm at the Greenfield Middle School as well, and among other things that I do, but I'm an IA there, and I'm really glad to be here.
Deborah, did I spell your name right? I just changed your name to B-A-Z-E-R.
Thank you. Yes.
Well, Dorothea, are you online? Let's see here. We've also got
Emma?
I'm Emma Stamis and Ed we're interested in doing the citizen science project with the BEECOLOGY with a group of hikers that we have. We have about over 60 hikers that hike in the Western Mass and Southern Vermont. we're also interested in helping with some of the school programs as volunteers.
And they're from Coleraine.
Yes.
So heads up if you're from Coleraine, you've got hot volunteers there.
Yeah.
Yep.
I don't see Rinky. Maybe she
was there.
Yeah. Tom, you want to introduce yourself? My name is Pam, by the way. Most of you I know already. But
My name's Tom Sullivan. I'm on the Nolan Baker Pollinator Project too, and I do pollinator habitat education and design.
I might add that Tom is well known for building mini meadows. Tom is well known for helping to build mini meadows. And if David Brule were on here, he's the head of the Nolan Baker Project, and we have a whole component of indigenous storytellers who are the traditional indigenous teachers who work with us, and that is actually Nolan Baker's specialty, is working with indigenous people. And it links with the pollinator program through the creation of seed. A lot of stories about seed and relationships between people and seed givers and creation stories. Dorothea, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Dorothea. I'm with the Nolan Baker Project. Glad to be here. Glad to see Dr. Gegear again.
And Dorothea is, you want to say something about, is a new master gardener. And so another really great addition to this team.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Introduce yourself. We're grateful for Dan Tynan, who is techie par excellence. Thank you, Dan.
I'm just the Zoom host for this. Let me stop the recording for this one so we can break up it into sections for people who miss it. And do we still need a minute or two for people to take a break?
Are we breaking into sections now, or is Dr.
No.
No.
No, raise your hand though if you need to have a break before we resume. Okay, and of course some people don't have video, so I can't say that. Let's just take 2 minutes before we restart.